Whispers from the Deep, a tale inspired by the Call of Cthulhu. The letter arrived in a tattered salt-stained envelope, smelling of the sea. It bore no return address, only my name, scrawled in a trembling, almost inhuman hand. I should have burned it the moment I saw it, but something in me demanded that I read it. The ink was faded, the words smeared as if written in desperation. Do not look for me. Do not seek the city. It wakes beneath the waves, and it knows you now. It was signed by Dr. Elias Wren, a man who had been dead for 20 years. Dr. Wren was more than a professor of anthropology. He was my mentor, my father figure. When I was a boy, he introduced me to the world of forgotten civilizations, cryptic languages, and things that history had deliberately buried. He vanished in 1908 while on an expedition off the coast of New England. His ship, the Obsidian Dawn, was found adrift. Its crew missing, the deck splattered with something dark and organic. The only clue was his journal, which I inherited upon his legal declaration of death. In it, he wrote of a submerged city older than mankind, hidden beneath the Atlantic, where the dreams of men and the nightmares of gods entwined. He called it Yahanfle, and he wrote of something watching from the abyss, something waiting. Now, 2 decades later, I held a letter penned by his very hand. That night, the sea called my name. It began as a whisper in the wind outside my window, a susurration that slithered through the trees. Then it grew, a low, guttural voice, chanting in a tongue my mind refused to comprehend. My body turned to ice as the syllables twisted and writhed like living things, coiling around my sanity. Then came the sound of wet footsteps. I lived alone. Heart hammering, I reached for the revolver in my desk. My fingers closed around the cold steel just as my bedroom door creaked open. A shadow stood in the doorway, its outline grotesquely misshapen, as if something humanoid had been drowned and reshaped by the pressure of the deep. I fired. The bullet struck flesh, but there was no blood, only the scent of salt and decay. It laughed, a horrid, gurgling sound. Then, in a voice that should not belong to anything of this earth, it rasped, "He is awake," and then it was gone. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, until I found the journal. I had locked it away for years, unwilling to revisit the madness of Dr. Wren's final entries. But now, it lay open on my desk, dripping with seawater. The pages had been rewritten in the same trembling hand as the letter. I was wrong. It was never dead. We only dreamed it was sleeping. Now it calls to its children. The ink was still wet. The journal had been rewritten in the night by someone or something that had been in my home. There was an address at the bottom of the page. Harker's Cove, Innsmouth. I had spent years researching that name. A coastal town shrouded in superstition, spoken of only in whispers by sailors who knew too much. A town where people vanished, where the sea claimed more than it ever returned. And now, as if summoned by the abyss itself, I was being called there. A single note was scrawled beneath the address. The monolith has risen. He is waiting for you. I did not know who he was, but something deep in my bones told me I would soon find out. The road to Innsmouth was nothing but a jagged scar carved through the wilds of Massachusetts. My car rattled as I drove through the fog-choked marshlands, the skeletal remains of long-dead trees clawing at the sky. The map said the town was ahead, but something felt wrong. Innsmouth wasn't supposed to be here. It had been abandoned for nearly a century, condemned by the government after some unspeakable event in 1928. No one spoke of what happened. No records remained. But now, the town stood before me, whole and untouched, as if it had never been lost. The sea whispered to me as I crossed the town limits, and in the distance I saw something move beneath the waves. I hadn't seen my mother since I was 5 years old. She had disappeared one night, leaving only the scent of brine on her pillow and a single word scrawled on the wall in a language my father refused to translate. When I was a child, I used to dream of her standing at the water's edge, staring at the moonlit horizon with unnatural stillness. I would call to her, but she never turned, never spoke. Now, as I stepped out of the car, I felt that same childhood fear claw at my throat. Something in the air was too familiar, the scent of salt and rot, the distant hum of voices that were not human. For the first time in years, I thought of my mother. And for the first time since childhood, I wondered if she had ever truly left. Innsmouth was not empty. Figures moved in the fog, shapes too tall, too thin, their shadows elongated in the moonlight. They stood in doorways, their eyes reflecting the glow of my headlights like those of deep-sea creatures. As I walked down the ruined main street, the ground squelched beneath my boots, wet, swollen like flesh left too long in water. The building sagged as if bloated from the inside. The air pulsed with something beneath my skin, something wrong. And then I saw them. A row of figures stood along the dock, their backs to me, motionless. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their hair damp with seawater. The wind howled through the empty streets, but they did not move. And then one turned its head slowly, impossibly, twisting too far on its neck. Its eyes were milky, lidless, dead, but aware. My breath turned to ice. They had been waiting for me. I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away from those impossible, unnatural things. My heart pounded as I stumbled through the ruins, my flashlight cutting through the mist. Then my foot struck something hard, a gravestone, half sunken into the wet, shifting earth. And as the beam of my flashlight passed over it, I felt my stomach drop into an abyss. The name carved into the stone was mine, but the date of death was tomorrow. And beneath it, a single phrase was etched deep into the stone. He is waiting for you beneath the tides. The wind howled, the fog swirled, and from the dock I heard something wet and heavy slither across the wood.